Good morning, everybody. I'm Professor Claire Callender. I am Professor of Higher Education Studies here at the IOE, and I'm also Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this event, which is CG's final conference in its current form. I think CG has been enormously privileged to have been the beneficiary of 8 years' worth of ESRC funding. It's provided all of us at CG with very exciting opportunities to develop new areas of research and new national and international collaborations. And today we'll be sharing some of the findings of our CG research. And appropriately, it is our research that is the focus of today's conference. And we've taken the title of today's conference from our original ESRC bid, which was about the future of higher education. And everybody in this audience will be able to judge, based on our presentations, if CG researchers have used the freedoms the ESRC funding has afforded us wisely and to good effect. But like all good research, ours raises many more questions than it answers. So all of us, I'm sure, will be continuing our research in some shape or form. And you can peruse our publications and some of our outputs outside the Jeffrey Hall. There's a list of publications, and Simon has written a final project report. Now, can I just move to some practical issues? Feel free to tweet. Oh, whoops. The details are at the bottom there. You should be able to access Wi-Fi via EduRoam. For those of you who don't have access to EduRoam, you can follow those instructions to access UCL's Wi-Fi system. Fire safety, no fire drill is planned today. So if you hear anything, get out as fast as you can. If you discover a fire, please break the glass at the nearest call point, and then the alarm system will sound continuously. The assembly point is in Woburn Square. Please don't use any of the building lifts. Use all emergency exits, which are all pretty well signposted, and go straight to the assembly point. The loos are at the back of the Jeffrey Hall, so if you go out into the lobby and turn left, you'll see the loos there. So that's the practical stuff. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Ashwin, Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University, and like Claire and David Mills, who will close the conference, I'm a Deputy Director of CG. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Simon Marginson, who will give this year's Burton Clark Lecture. The Burton Clark Lecture Series has run since 2016 and is funded through an endowment generously given to UCL by the late Adele Clark in memory of her husband, Burton Clark. Burton Clark was one of the most influential higher education researchers who shaped the field of higher education research through his publications and through his thinking. It is particularly apposite that Simon should give this year's lecture, as he played a key role in bringing the Burton Clark Lecture to UCL. How to introduce Simon? It's a bit of a daunting task, I have to say. Simon is Professor of Higher Education at the University of Oxford and the Director of CG. Simon is without doubt the leading global scholar of higher education, which is reflected in the group of researchers that he brought together in the work of CG. I'm very grateful to have benefited personally from the rich academic climate and the intellectual generosity that Simon has established in CG. Simon has written over 450 publications and is joint editor-in-chief of the journal Higher Education. Simon has been the recipient of numerous international academic awards, and in 2014 was the Clark Kerr Lecturer on Higher Education at the University of California, Berkeley. Simon's lecture today is entitled The Three Dilemmas of Higher Education, Reflections on Clark, CG and Higher Education Studies. As with all of Simon's contributions to the field, it will be inspiring and intellectually challenging in equal measure. Simon.
Good. See how we go. We're working. Well, it's really good to see so many colleagues here, some of whom have been here for 8 years of these conferences. Great to be involved with you again this year and look forward to a really interesting day today. And I want to thank you kindly, Paul, and you and Claire for your stalwart contributions to CG, to our joint work, our collective work since the beginning. Indeed, look, thank you to all of our researchers, administrators and comms wizards, and Chris Millward and other members of the advisory board who are here. I also want to thank my wife, Anna, who has been my intellectual companion in the long march through CG. Now, this lecture covers much ground in a short time. My first departmental head, who likes studies with smaller scope, used to call the big picture approach round the world for sixpence. I trust you will tolerate the big picture approach for a few minutes. I'm going to review the evolution of higher education in 3,000 years of evolution, the emergence of higher education research as a field of inquiry, and CG's contribution to that field since it began in 2015. And then I want to discuss three dilemmas that I see confronting the field of research and higher education as a whole. And finally, at the end, some thoughts about the future. Well, what is higher education? Well, think about what we do in higher education and you'll know the answer. I mean, in a world of ever-emerging difference, the core of higher education has scarcely changed in 3,000 years across every variation of time, place and culture. There was one exception, but it added to the core rather than replacing it. I'll come to that in a minute. In the first academies in China in the Western Zhou dynasty in around about 1000 BCE, the Buddhist monasteries in northern India like Vikramashila and Nalanda, the academy in Athens, the scholarly madrasas and the Islamic mosques and the high point of Islamic scholarship, in the medieval European universities, beginning with Bologna in 1088 CE, and the successor universities in Euro-America and then across the world. The constant core of higher education has been the cultural formation of persons, in what Gert Biester calls socialisation and subjectification. Subjectification refers to their development as autonomous persons capable of reflexive action on their own behalf. Now, the methods of personal formation in education have also been largely constant. The self-forming student is immersed in knowledge, guided by teachers. Everywhere, the same technologies have been used repeatedly. Knowledge expressed in texts, on paper and now on screen, classroom organisation, educational assessment, student selection by examination, and certification. It goes right back to the beginning. This intrinsic core of cultural formation has been joined to many different extrinsic purposes of higher education, from the training of state officials in China to religious formation, scholarship and scholarly expertise in the Indian monasteries and in Islamic Cordoba and Damascus, to that, plus the training of lawyers and doctors in medieval Europe, to the preparation of graduates in a great range of occupations across the world today. Yet all these extrinsic purposes, these different purposes in different societies, are achieved on the foundation of the intrinsic cultural core of learning, knowledge, teachers, texts, classes, exams. The same technique is used repeatedly. Now, the different forms of higher education have another common feature. Their dual spatiality. Now, by that I mean higher education typically combines a place-based bound materiality and identity with universalising knowledge and the mobility of ideas and persons, wandering students, wandering scholars going between different centres. It's happened again and again. Knowledge and communication have always flowed pretty freely in this higher education world. And this space making beyond the nation state has been crucial to the partial autonomy of institutions. So when the one big change happened in 1810, it eventually went everywhere. And that was von Humboldt's plan for the University of Berlin, which added intellectual inquiry and research to the intrinsic core of learning and knowledge. And this changed knowledge. Scholarship moved from received dogma to something evolving and open to scepticism. Yet higher education was still cultural formation. In fact, the Humboldtian reform strengthened learning through immersion in knowledge. And that reform was then built into the first American research university at Johns Hopkins in 1876, and from there swept across the leading US institutions. One after another adopted the Johns Hopkins and ultimately Humboldtian approach. After World War II, of course, especially after 1970, it swept across the whole world, that model. And for a long time, US higher education was way ahead of the others. It housed 2/3 of the world R&D in 1960 and achieved 50% tertiary participation by 1971 compared to 15% then in the UK and in most Western European countries. And in the 1960s and 1970s, 3 US scholars at the University of California developed a new way of thinking about higher education. Clark Kerr, Martin Trow, and Bob Clark. Burton R. Clark was called Bob Clark. Now, Clark Kerr wrote as a university president, absorbed by the inner dynamics of large comprehensive research universities. And he coined the notion of the multiversity, which emphasised multiplicity, diverse purposes, norms, visions, interests, groups, stakeholders, agendas. And that notion, I think, anticipated postmodernism in some respects. Martin Trow was a sociologist who situated higher education in larger social evolution. His problems in the transition from elite to mass higher education, probably the most important paper ever written about higher education in the modern period, explained how massification differentiated higher education into 3 kinds of education: selective elite formation, middle-level mass occupational preparation, and universal forms of participation. And he rejected the idea that growth in higher education was shaped by economic demand for skills. It was driven by social demand for opportunity and betterment, and there would be no end to the expansion process. And Trow proved absolutely right about that. Bob Clark was a sociologist of the university as an organisation. He was fascinated by the intersection between the intrinsic learning and research core and institutional power, and examined it cross-culturally, studying Europe, Japan and the Soviet Union. In 1983, his influential book, The Higher Education System, described a collegial higher education world, predominantly bottom-up, flatness, ambiguity, looseness, disorder in work organisation and governance. Higher education was changing, and Clark noted the growth of state power and professional administration, but I think for him they were at that stage still subordinate themes. His famous triangle positioned the academic oligarchy as one of the 3 modes of national system coordination and described market coordination as bottom-up and the opposite of top-down state coordination. Within a decade, the neoliberal revolution had arrived. Governments were using managed market competition as an instrument of rule, and inside institutions, the academic oligarchy was giving ground to the university executive. However, I think the main contribution, the main achievement of Kerr, Trow and Clark was this: they created higher education research. They saw higher education as a distinctive domain for inquiry, with dynamics that cannot be exhaustively explained using theories and methods developed for other fields. This is their key insight into social reality. Higher education has its own dynamics. It's not entirely different to other sectors, other forms of organisation, but it has specific features that we need to understand. And we're still discovering those dynamics while fending off policy constructs that don't understand the sector. As Clark said, it does not make much sense to evaluate business firms according to how much they look like universities, nor economic systems according to their resemblances to higher education systems. Neither does it make any sense to do the reverse. Of the features specific to higher education, Clark emphasised knowledge, ever a mystery, central to university organisation, shaping identity and behaviour, endemically incomplete, don't we know it, the driver of continuing diversity in the sector. Well, let's pause the story for a moment to reflect on the field of higher education research enabled by Kerr, Trow and Clark. Higher education research is not a discipline. It's multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. It's a field of inquiry with a primarily applied bent, like public health. Much is instrumental and unpublished, executed for institutions, governments and companies. Yet, higher education matters. It excites curiosity and calls up theorisation. New concepts, findings and explanations feed back into applied research and practice. As in all social science, there is an endemic lack of effective connection between research and practice. It needs astute operators at both ends of the relation who understand each other. It needs to have Vicky Bolivar doing research on widening participation in the UK and Chris Millward at the Office for Students who understands what she's doing and can use it usefully in his work. It needs that kind of relationship. And of course, timing is crucial to impact in government. I mean, you must be there when someone is asking, and you must be there when someone is listening. And when no one is listening, it's difficult. You wait for government to change. Now, the examples in the slide are just examples. I mean, they're not the sum of all possible research in the box, let me assure you. There are differing... the point I want to make, I think, is that there are different units of observation and analysis, and we can think about the different purposes or functions of higher education as well as a way of thinking about the field. Now, the different units do play a significant role methodologically and theoretically in the field. There's the local student or classroom level, there's the institutional level, which has been very important in research in the field. The national system, again, very important in research in the field. They're the units used most often. International comparisons are widely employed, and they have been at CG, and a few of us, of course, also treat the world as a whole as a unit of analysis in this field. Now, of course, much research is focused on the local institution as an end in itself. For example, its comparative performance or its bottom line, and the national higher education system is also treated as an end in itself, as a subject for inquiry or an object of inquiry in itself. For example, work on system design or efficiency or financing. Now, let's go back to the story. Now, we're now in the 32 years between the higher education system, the book, and the opening of CG. Clark's work was followed by three great transformations. The social transformation, that is massification of higher education, the policy transformation, that is neoliberalism, and the ontological transformation, which is globalisation. Massification, well, since the mid-1970s, when that UK participation rate was a little bit above 15%, the 3,000-year-old model of cultural formation has been radically scaled up in nearly all high-income and middle-income countries and some low-income countries as well. The world gross tertiary enrolment ratio has risen from 11% in 1975 to 42% in 2022, And this has remade system design, delivery, governance, management and financing. Neoliberal regulation emerged in the Anglophone 1980s to foster capital accumulation in and through public activities like higher education. Institutions became reimagined in policy from producers of multiple public and private goods to competitive money-making businesses. Education and research was reimagined as commodities subject to performance management. The student was reimagined from a self-forming learning subject immersed in knowledge, the classical form of higher education, to a consumer in an economic market effectively purchasing future earnings from institutions. Globalisation. Well, accelerated economic and cultural globalisation really took off at the end of the Cold War under conditions of US global hegemony in politics, the economy, science, culture and education. Trade barriers were coming down, supply chains were flourishing. Global integration was being quickened by network communications after the internet began in 1989. And higher education and knowledge in this period were extensively globalised culturally without fully integrating into the business side of the capitalist economy. But the 1990s globalisation coincided with neoliberalism and its rolling out in policy spaces all over the world. And this established the policy primacy of economics in higher education, the myth of the global knowledge economy, the commercial market in student mobility, and the worldwide ordering based on university rankings. For more than 25 years, states were liberal capitalist supporters of internationalisation in higher education and science. Anglophone states, I think, wanted to expand Anglophone cultural influence in missionary fashion with the spread of English, the integration of non-Western countries into the Euro-American cultural norms and political norms. Student mobility was expected to encourage trade, and cosmopolitan cultural inclusion was expected to optimise market reach. We now know that the support of states for liberal capitalist internationalisation was of its time, not a permanent condition. But it facilitated a great flourishing of cross-border higher education. The network global science system grew by 5% a year, and cross-border collaboration peaked at 23% of all science papers in 2020, since gone down slightly. Cross-border student mobility rose from 1.9 million students in 1998 to 6.4 million in 2021. About 2 students in every 5 were paying commercial fees. The same year, it's 2021, 22% of doctoral students in OECD countries cross borders for study. This is very impressive internationalisation in a generation. Anglophone-style education and science became globally distributed, though on a plural rather than a homogenous basis, without integrating non-Western countries into the US political hegemony. Between 2003 and 2022, science papers from China multiplied by 10 from 89,000 in the 19-year period to 899,000 in 2022. In the 2023 Leiden ranking of high citation papers, China had 10 of the top 14 universities in the world in physical sciences and engineering, and the top 9 in mathematics and computing. Only Singapore seems really competitive with China in STEM. Tsinghua has become world's top STEM university in high citation science, passing MIT. Science has also grown quickly in the non-Western middle powers like India and South Korea and Brazil and Turkey and Iran. The result is we now have a world in which there's a kind of global contradiction, a deep tension between the spread of post-colonial university capacity and the continued neo-colonial models of institution and the organisation of knowledge. Journals, bibliometrics and Times Higher and QS ranking are still patterned by the 1990 US cultural hegemony. English is the only language of universal global science. There's no effort to create a translation regime between languages at that level. Rankings are grounded in the ideal Anglophone science university. The vast bulk of human knowledge is excluded as merely local knowledge. Internationalisation in higher education in many countries is experienced as invasive Western internationalisation and a crisis of purpose and identity. At first sight, world higher education seems to be more Americanised than it was in the time of Kerr, Shro and Clark. But in reality, it's a different world, one moving rapidly towards something else. Well, how has CGHE responded to these great transformations? Well, CGHE has worked across a wider range of topics than other research centres on higher education, with multiple responses to neoliberalism and globalisation. No CGHE project directly addresses massification, although the History Project 7 that Vincent has led has traced the trajectory of massification in France and England. Project 1 on student learning, Project 5 on the graduate loan burden, and Project 8 on the public good contributions of higher education all focus on humanist domains that are suppressed by the student as consumer discourse. Project 3's research on research moves well beyond a solely economic framing of knowledge, without excluding that. Project 4 on the graduate labour market investigates not so-called low-value courses, but graduate jobs, the nature of graduate jobs, and labour market equity. Project 6 on governance unpicks the corporatised university. Projects 8, 9 and 10 in different ways map the global space and global relations. Project 2 brings online MOOCs into the global south. So substantial and multiple responses to globalisation and to neoliberalism. Now, the table positions 10 current and 6 former CGHE projects in the field. The placement, let me say, is ambiguous and arbitrary, and most people will find something to question in the table, I'm sure. There's more information about projects on the CGHE website, and you will soon hear from the project leaders. Now, this slide adds my own additional research and conceptual inquiries into higher education, individual and joint, during the lifetime of CGHE. Now, most CGHE projects work on either an intrinsic or an extrinsic aspect of higher education in several different geographical scales. I think multiple spatial lenses have been the strength of CGHE. Perhaps its major innovation was to work with multiple spatiality from the start. Systematic international comparisons have been used certainly formally in half the projects, but actually in more than half of the projects when you add it all up. Note that there's a concentration in certain boxes here. Concentration of work using the national system lens for extrinsic society building, as I've called it. Now, that refers to a lot of the big policy issues. The close interests of CGHE researchers and the funders of CGHE, which were ESRC, of course, but originally HEFCE, we acknowledge the contribution that Chris Millward and David Sweeney have made to all of this, having pioneered, I think, the establishment of CGHE very early. The close interests of the funders in contributions to national policy. And CGHE's responded to that by producing data on graduate employment, effects of loan debt, governance, the public good function of institutions, tuition loan systems, and on the private higher education sector, which was a 5-year project in the first iteration of CGHE. Now, there are less projects, I think, focused on the intrinsic core of higher education, but the ones that are there have got weighty agendas, including Project 1 on student learning and Project 3 on research, and they've both collected enormous volume of comparative data, all of which is currently reaching the publication stage or is being published now. Now, few CGHE projects use the institutional lens, which is interesting, isn't it? Because in the field, the institutional lens is used a great deal, the single corporation or single university as the focus. We didn't do that so much, but the governance project certainly did that and did it very, very well with its 3 major books. CGHE researchers, I think you can say, criticise the mainstream and contribute to it. It's typical of social science, really, like Habermas's public sphere. Chronically unsatisfied with the state, connecting with data and connecting to the state with data and constructive ideas, and dreaming a bit. CGHE generates knowledge and its work is used. Yet, the world has changed again since most of the CG projects were conceived. And I think the future of higher education is more fragile and contested than it was in 2014, before Trump, before Brexit. And I see three deep-seated dilemmas that are affecting higher education itself and therefore the field of research. Well, we say that higher education has never been so important. We talk it up a lot. The fact that we need to talk it up is a sign of something. Its position is not as strong and stable as we would like to think it is. The UK government treats the universities as a kind of whipping horse with little pushback outside the sector and no concern about the plunging unit of resource. Higher education is stronger in Nordic Europe and especially in East Asia, which might be its bastion in future. But it seems brittle in many places. Violations of autonomy and academic freedom are multiplying. Government interventions in curricula, think of Hungary, research cooperation and student mobility. And every day now we're looking at new news about restrictions on student mobility. If Trump wins, what's happened in Florida will spread across the US, and American science, which is so important to us, will be in trouble. The political flack is a symptom of deeper problems that have evolved out of massification, neoliberalism and globalisation. Left unaddressed, these problems have festered. Well, first, is equality of opportunity impossible? 60 years ago, with the great help of the OECD at the time, schooling and higher education were positioned by education researchers and policymakers as sectors that could transform modern society into an egalitarian meritocracy. The ideal was the equal distribution across all social categories of participation, student achievement, educational outcomes and graduate careers, so that education would function as the great articulator and redistributor, and people's starting positions would no longer determine their ultimate life chances. That mission soaked into social science and in some form has shaped popular understanding of the role of higher education and schooling everywhere. Education is meant to solve the inequalities driven by capital accumulation. All societies have learned to expect progress on equal opportunity, social mobility and equity through our sector, though many of those societies also tolerate high institutional stratification. But we must face the fact that the long struggle to lift social equality of opportunity through education has failed in all countries, whether high capitalist or social democratic. While we bring great benefits to many individuals, including those who are first in their families in higher education, we now know that our work alone cannot remake the social aggregates. Reform of higher education alone is never sufficient to drive social equalisation, and massification made this harder to achieve. We alone cannot correct an unequal capitalist order. The failure of equality of opportunity is readily understood in countries with high stratification or financial barriers or discrimination, or where families invest privately to improve their odds, as with independent schooling in the UK. The competitive structures fostered by neoliberal reform have also favoured families best equipped to compete. But the failure to advance social equality through education is apparent also in Nordic countries where systems are less stratified. There is free access to institutions of high quality and a social consensus about equality and solidarity and very high participation rates. Nordic states work hard on equality in education, but have been unable to leverage that to secure greater overall equality in society, though arguably they have been able to hold the line better than other countries. They've resisted to a greater extent the overall tendency to greater inequality in the last 30 years. But Nordic family background continues to govern access to the high demand law and medicine courses, and it shapes, most importantly, it shapes unequal outcomes at work. The problem is exacerbated by a secular trend associated with massification. Expansion of participation improves equity as inclusion, which is certainly worthwhile, but not distributive equity in social outcomes. All else being equal, as total participation expands, student numbers in elite universities expand at a slower than average rate, increasing scarcity at the top, stretching the vertical calibration of degree power. Raising the stakes and narrowing the gate intensifies competition for places at the top, and that inexorably favours middle-class families best equipped to win the competition. As Trow noted 50 years ago, and has been repeatedly confirmed empirically, newly participating families enter the less prestigious institutions, limiting the scope to foster equality while preserving the character of elite universities and their traditional clientele. Vicky Bolivar states, "Our fundamental mistake is to believe that greater social mobility is the desired goal and that increased equality of opportunity is the way to achieve it. In reality, neither is possible without greater equality of condition. In a more equal society, not only would it be easier for those from relatively disadvantaged family backgrounds to get to university and to experience higher education to the full, it would also matter much less for any given individual's future socioeconomic prospects whether they went to university or not. Yet society still widely believes that higher education, not social background or once year in the workplace, determines career outcomes, that we should be judged by the extent of social mobility that society that is achieved, and that no institution should be unrepresentative of society. Now, this bar is too high. We have oversold our capacity to deliver mobility and justice through our own practices alone. Disappointed expectations undermine public support for higher education, which at any moment can flip over into perceptions of higher education as a conspiracy of the elite. Then disappointed expectations merge with the resentments of those who've been excluded altogether. Segmentation between people with and without higher education is readily mobilised now in populist political campaigns. Now that participation has expanded to half the population, but not to everyone, the stratification and exclusion effects of higher education are more visible on a larger scale than either its contribution to the earning power of graduates, which tends to fall as massification, on average, as massification advances, or its potentials to lift opportunity and mobility. So that's the first dilemma. Long-standing, a trap partly of our own making, and becoming more difficult as massification has advanced, continually undermining our public reputation. What can we do about this? Well, we continue to strive for practical equality at every stage, or higher education becomes more socially unequal, blighting lives and emptying out its popular legitimacy. And I think this is what's happening now in the United States. Second, we scale back expectations by shifting the attentions of social research to sectors that are more directly determining the political economy of social equality, such as the wage and pay scales and government tax and spend regimes. And the OECD is quite clear that it's those two areas, those two parts of society which have the most effect on income and wealth distribution. Second is higher education, cultural and economic. Well, you've already heard me argue that the core of higher education is cultural formation through immersion in knowledge. And this has long sustained the broad development of students as people and in social relations. The high points of this great tradition perhaps are Confucian self-cultivation in East Asia and the Bildung idea in Germany. Cultural formation has been annexed in a flexible manner to many extrinsic purposes. Where the program has been vocational, the same methods of cultural formation have been used. Without changing purpose or method, the intrinsic core has proven to be very adaptable. Higher education and knowledge have a kind of chameleon-like quality. One clue, I think, to the long continuance of the university form. But there are limits to this. Cultural formation enables the multiplicity that Clark Kerr discussed. Studies repeatedly show that students have multiple objectives. They want personal growth and experience. They want immersion in disciplinary knowledge, many of them. And they want graduate jobs, almost all of them. It's not either or. But the objectives are distinct. Higher education is more like schooling than like work. Agentic positioning, goals, values, knowledges, skills and required behaviours in higher education are different to those in the workplace. The best training in skills and employability is in the job. Understanding the heterogeneity of higher education and work is the first step to improving the transitions and combinations between higher education and work. Intrinsic learning in higher education is foundational to graduate work. It augments student agency, it provides specific knowledge and pre-vocational skills that underpin on-the-job learning. Direct vocational preparation in work experience or internship and of course job search skill are add-ons essentially to the intrinsic learning process. Even in many occupational courses, the transition to the workplace is challenging and takes time. Higher education and work are loosely coupled. The relation between higher education work is not a linear flow. To press education and work into one process, either by treating them as essentially the same or by subordinating one to the other, is to violate either work or higher education. No prizes for guessing which one. However, the pure human capital vision, education focused solely on productivity and employability, now dominates in many parts of the world in policy and in public debate in many countries, which are rightly concerned about graduate underemployment. And the focus on narrow employability carries a certain moral authority because it speaks to concerns about the right to work, which is widely felt as it should be. So governments now more confidently press for the remaking of higher education by pushing the sphere of work back into education and measuring education in vocational economic terms, installing extrinsic job preparation inside the intrinsic core of higher education, as with the TEF salary data as a measure of teaching. This is a second trap. Again, we're being asked to meet a policy challenge, that of meaningful, well-remunerated work for everyone, that we do not have the power to solve from within higher education alone. But the bottom line is that neoliberal policy does not see higher education in the form of personal formation in knowledge as optimal for productivity and growth. If government set out today to design a new higher education system focused on employable graduates, it would not use cultural formation, knowledge organised in academic disciplines, and the teaching research nexus. I think it's only a matter of time before a new model of job-ready education is proposed that unwinds the cultural core, promising greater efficiency in job security while radically stripping back autonomous self-formation in knowledge, deconstructing the foundations of university organisation and academic work. And the Australian government, the previous one, had a go at this with its Job Ready Graduates package. It wasn't able to bring it off though. So that's the second dilemma. It's arisen in the last decade or so as neoliberal policy has obtained a greater hold. But higher education, trying to deal with all of this, has become partly complicit. So what can be done? Well, it's certainly not enough to respond by saying we don't want culture versus economics, we want culture and economics. I think matters have gone too far for that to be a sufficient line of defence. The singular economic framework is rapidly marginalising support in the public sphere for cultural formation. And so we need to make the case, which no one has been making very vigorously, for cultural formation as a process. And that means coming out hard and publicly in support of the role of knowledge and the benefits of student engagement in knowledge, as Paul Ashwin does. And if we don't advocate knowledge and cultural formation and the shared empowerment and democratic agency and better workforce ultimately that it brings, then no one else will. We should also advocate research like the research that the CGHE Project 1 has been doing into the formative effects of student learning right through the process from higher education and into graduate work. Third, is higher education national or global? Now, this is a more recent problem. Until 2018 or thereabouts, many people would rightly say both. It's both global and national. And I mean, I agree with that position. It is both global and national, as far as I can see. But there's now pressure on institutions and persons in many Euro-American countries to choose global or national, to maintain their position in the national scale, where higher education is, of course, housed and funded, by disavowing or reducing the global engagement. And this is weakening learning, research, and the autonomy of the sector. Globalisation enabled the sector to explore its dual spatiality and mobility in many ways. Millions of people have used cross-border mobility to create possibilities and build their personal agency. Global science evolved as a bottom-up network outside national control. Governments could alter the participation of their institutions in global science with difficulty, but they couldn't alter the network itself. Nor could they lock out global science, because it's an essential resource now for governments and industry. Anglophone institutions expanded their strategic freedoms in cross-border partnerships, university consortia, offshore branches, and online education, which, like communication between scientists, couldn't be nationally regulated. Whole systems combined action in the national and global scales to enhance the outcome in both. The US used the relatively open border to draw global talent into its universities and sustain their global leadership. The UK and Australia worked the market in cross-border education to build resources, deepening their research capacity, thereby enhancing their global reputation, creating a virtuous circle that rotated through the scales. China did something similar. It pursued a national global synergy supported by growing state investment with spectacular results. International collaboration, especially into the US, helped it to build national infrastructure while taking China-based researchers to the cutting edge. State funding drew back diasporic scientists, built capacity further. Compared to the Anglophone nations, I think China has had less outreach and more national capacity building. But China now leads the world in STEM. Again, global and national actions have strengthened the other in a circular process, continually reproducing itself. University leaders and scientists understand the global as a distinctive zone of activity. So do mobile students and educators working to form global citizens. However, governments see cross-border activity through the lens of methodological nationalism, the belief that the nation state and society are the natural form of the world. When internationalisation is seen merely as a national arms race in innovation, the distinctive global space becomes marginalised, and global phenomena are seen as solely an outgrowth of nations and determined by them. But states can be temporary internationalists, and as long as Pax Americana allowed Euro-American states to focus on economic goals rather than national order and security, and states and economic elites drew material benefits from globalisation, they were in principle supporters of liberal capitalist internationalisation, and higher education was free to practice the national and the global at the same time. Now, this began to change first around about 2010, global financial crisis. The growth of world trade and offshoring slowed and supply chains began to shorten. By the mid-2010s, nation-bound thinking in the economy, economic protectionism, and also nativism and opposition to migration were all on the rise. In 2016, Brexit and Trump rammed the point home. Things were changing. At the same time, the rise of China and other non-Western powers was weakening US global dominance, and this fostered disillusionment in the US with liberal openness and fed popular anxieties about loss of status across the Euro-American world. There was no evident decline in the momentum of globalisation in higher education. However, a fault line between national polities and globally engaged universities had opened up, and it was just a matter of time before global links in higher education became problematised by policymakers. By the early 2020s, this was apparent across Euro-America. Dutch and Danish politicians moved to put a cap on incoming students. In 2023, last year, UK, Canada and Australia all announced new limitations on student mobility foregoing part of the revenue, offering various pretexts, but in fact responding to migration sensitivity. And we're seeing in daily reports now of how that is playing out in the changing pattern of visa granting, reductions in visa numbers, and also in the pushback and debate about all of this coming from international education. But bigger things were happening too. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which forced the mobility of many Ukrainian faculty and students, also isolated Russian universities from all global dealings. It took a whole country out of the global academic circuit. The Putin regime now routinely labels its critics as foreign agents, making the point as you absolutely have to choose between a nation-bound view of the world and your connection to the rest of the world. But perhaps the most significant regression because of its long-term impact has been the US decoupling from China in global science. The US-China relation is the largest collaborative pairing in the science system by far. In 2018, the Trump government's China initiative, which had bipartisan support, empowered federal authorities to investigate joint China-US appointments and projects. And researchers with Chinese backgrounds were stigmatised. A survey by Jenny Lee found that 20% of US scientists of Chinese descent and 12% of other scientists broke ties with China after the China initiative. Visas for Chinese doctoral students in some fields are restricted, and US university leaders are discouraged from visiting China. I was at Tsinghua in October, and they told me there, this is the leading STEM university in the world, that no US university president had visited since 2018. And before that, there were people coming through every month or so. Complete change has occurred in that kind of academic diplomacy. The number of joint US-China research papers is now falling. And the number of collaborative papers in global science, the proportion that are authored by people from more than one country, is also falling as a proportion of the total number of papers. And the US is pressuring the rest of the West to follow the decoupling process as far as they will take it. Though few research ties are really insensitive domains, states are now regulating China linkages on the basis of blanket securitisation. Higher education is expected just to fall into line. And for its part, China is keeping all the borders open and wants continued engagement, but its rhetoric is becoming more nationally strident than before. So the shared global space, crucial to higher education, its identity and its autonomy and maximisation of its contribution to everywhere, is being diminished. In the Anglosphere, the old imperial perspective, methodological globalisation with the US national centre, is fading away, and it's being replaced by pure methodological nationalism and the project of the nation and its allies in a fragmented Hobbesian world seen as irretrievably divided and hostile and dangerous. Now, given that agentic mobility of persons and knowledge is foundational to the freedom and identity of higher education, violations engendered by geopolitics and single-scale nationalism do not bode well. The spreading securitisation of research places in jeopardy the collective science system, the combined repository of knowledge, and that repository is crucial to addressing the climate-nature emergency. This threat to dual spatiality is a second existential crisis for higher education. So that's the third dilemma. Not a dilemma until recently, when then the political context changed and we had to choose. So what can be done? Well, I think institutions must defy the methodological nationalism and maintain a plural outlook on geography and scale, find a way to remain global by operating separately from the states that fund and regulate them if necessary. And this is going to require courage. That's a high value in our culture, but we can all find it when we need it. And we do need it here. So I've talked about three dilemmas that problematise the future of higher education. Perhaps if we were starting CGHE today, though, we would focus also on the future of a troubled world. First, I think we need to lift social justice and equality out of our backyards, beyond the national and into the global as well. We have no framework for global justice and equality in education and knowledge. In the global scale, rights of equality are also rights of diversity. If we are to progress a stable global order based on multipolarity, which is the reality that we must now address and deal with, without a hegemon. It'll be an order that's grounded in the Chinese concept of He Wu Butong, unity and diversity, where there is freedom to be yourself, but you're also obliged to others at the same time. And the EU exactly follows this kind of approach, in my view. It is the form of governance that we need to look to at an international level and build on. We can move this order forward in higher education and knowledge ahead of states. We must press the major publishers and the bibliometric system to incorporate knowledge from all languages in a multilingual publishing and translation regime. Well, second, politics. In almost every Euro-American country and some others, politics is nervous, faltering, destabilised by the anxiety and lost future of the climate-nature emergency. Within a power vacuum created in the transition from US hegemony to a multipolar world, nation-states must learn to coexist without a global policeman, and national polities need to find a way to consensus. If we fail, we slide into endemic warfare. It's already started. Higher education is where students are prepared in social relations and informed as reflexive persons capable of social action as individuals and in networks and groups collectively. One way forward to a more stable political environment based on distributed agency, strong locality, strong agency from below as well as effective coordination from above, is education. We need to start to prepare people to live in a different way politically. Finally, the big one, the climate-nature emergency. Economies grounded in Anglophone liberal capitalist accumulation cannot solve this and are most emphatically part of the problem. Despite its traumas, the state is the only feasible point of coordination. The market cannot fix this. Those states will need to become better at devolving responsibilities within a framework of overall coordination, because much of the crisis will play out at local level. At the CGHE conference in 10 years, we might be discussing the transformation of higher education to contribute to state-led mitigation, disaster relief, and the reconstruction of social and political systems. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Simon. That was remarkable. I think the way in which we brought together the development of the field of higher education and the development of the higher education system and the field of research was remarkable. I think the sobering challenges you presented to us that face higher education, the importance of higher education taking responsibility for the power it has to contribute to society and being the ones to speak up for higher education was much needed. So thank you, that was wonderful. We'll now move to questions. So we can hear from as many voices as possible, I'll take questions in groups of 3. If you could, when you ask your question, just say who you are and your institutional location, just so people know, that would be really helpful. Please wait for the microphone to reach you before you ask your question, just so that people on the live stream will be able to hear the question. So who would like to kick us off? There's someone back there.
Good morning. Hi, Simon. Jim McKinley from UCL Institute of Education. And I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this framing of the dilemmas, and I really appreciate that you've got directions that we can take from them. I have a question around the kind of reactive, proactive approaches to addressing these dilemmas, because we still see it happening, and it's one of those situations where we can identify the dilemmas, but we have situations where it's getting worse, right? So, for example, the teaching research nexus continues to bifurcate. We have students who have their expectations about what they're getting out of their degrees, looking at universities as training centers rather than places to explore intellectual curiosity. So if this is the direction that things are going in, do we continue to react to them in the hope that we can address the problems as we identify them, or is there some incredible potential major shift, perhaps, in a proactive way that could be used to redirect these dilemmas?
Great, thank you. Another question in front here.
Tristan McCowan from here, UCL Institute of Education. Thanks for taking us around the world for a sixpence. It's a value for money. I wanted to pick up on the point you made right at the start of the Humboldtian rupture, 1810, and a new approach to knowledge, bringing in inquiry, open-ended inquiry, skepticism, and so forth into the university. I think everyone would agree was an important move for universities. But perhaps this is sacrilegious to say this in this room, but is there a negative side to that? I mean, that wasn't the first time that this kind of inquiry had taken place. It had been outside universities in scholarly societies and amateur science and so forth probably for different periods of time in different parts of the world, but in Europe for at least a couple of 100 years before.
That's right.
And that's largely been lost. I mean, there are some countries in which there are separate research institutes outside universities, and even in specialist institutes, NASA and so forth, in certain places. But to a large extent, research is now something that we see as taking place naturally inside universities and not without it. So is there a negative side to that? Mm-hmm. Has that disempowered people from being researchers and scholars?
Thanks. And then one more question. I'm going to stand up so I can actually see people. Do you have one more, or shall we? Okay, let's move on those two questions. So reactive, proactive dilemmas and the negative side to research being incorporated into universities.
Yeah, very nice points in different ways, both of them. I think what's the potential for a forward move, and where, of course, I think we talk about working not only from the university or from the higher education or tertiary education institution or the school, but we also talk about working with other people in the public sphere, clearly. And communications, media, good media in particular, seems a really important place to me. I think that taking up a kind of social transformation agenda is the way forward, and I've tried to sketch a few elements of that at the end. I think that, because I think we're all probably pretty nervous about politics, about the way it's going. Governance and politics are not working in lots of ways, and that capacity to unite the bottom up and the top down is clearly the issue, and yet there are many examples in history where this has been done better. UNESCO is trying to grab towards a solution there with its common good idea, which has got a strong communitarian flavour. Dewey ended up in the same place, I think, when he was talking about, democracy. That bottom-up element's really important. But I think top-down is really important as well, because we need coordinated responses to the climate crisis and the whole problem of food and water, and you might say the larger problem of political economy beyond, what's happening in the financial markets, the larger problem of sustaining our material culture and reproducing it economically. So I think that politics, the regeneration of politics, and the sorts of ways in which we prepare people for civic life, political life, and we do that in education, we do prepare people, that becomes a very important domain for us to think about. And maybe what we need to do is return to the general education idea to a degree, think of the first year of programs across the board as being in some ways partly preparation for civic and political life and social activehood, focusing on the relational dimension and emphasising the values, the moral values that sustain a society as a successful, open, democratic, plural, and respectful and productive society. All those things together. So I think maybe we need to think about the general curriculum again, and we also, I think, probably need to do some work at the other end as well around these issues. As well as preparing graduates for the transition into work, we should be preparing people for the transition into civic and political life. Because, as I said, I think a lot of problems are going to be at the local level in the future, and we need to prepare people at that level. That was always the great strength of American democracy, wasn't it? Its fantastic local dimension was always better than its sort of national top-down and federal state negotiation dimension was that local dimension. On the question of the university and it's the Humboldtian moment, nice point, Tristan. I agree with you fully, of course. I think everyone who knows the history would agree. And yes, I think something was lost in the institutionalisation of sceptical inquiry. It's centring on the university, although it hasn't been extinguished altogether outside the university either. It always was a sort of class-based thing, wasn't it? And I think it's continued as a class-based thing to some extent outside the university. The university made it possible for the state to instrumentalise it in a way which to a degree democratised it and opened it up to talent more directly. And that's all been good. But I think that we do have and I didn't develop this as a fourth dilemma, but maybe it is a kind of lurking dilemma as well. The problem of how the institutionalisation of sceptical inquiry has played out it's found itself in the world of bibliometrics, performance management of research papers, and publish or perish, and with publishers driving, in many respects, driving the pace and the rhythm of it. And there are all those studies which show that the cutting-edge creativity is diminishing as a proportion of total research. And a colleague of mine in Australia, Peter Murphy, has been saying this for 20 years, and Nature and Science are now saying it. The institutionalisation in the contemporary period, in the neoliberal period, I think we could say has been, in some respects, quite a problem. And that's probably got implications for both reform of the university and support for inquiry outside the university. But certainly turning science into, an instrument of individual career formation and has been in itself quite a problem.
Okay, more questions over here. Yeah. Okay. And then, yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your historical perspective on higher education. I am Amadou Jaman from Bloomsbury Institute, London. I just wanted to ask about what you see is the future of higher education in Africa and how that can add to the socio-economic development of Africa as a region. Thank you.
And could you pass the microphone the other way, please? I think this will be the last question.
Hello. Hi, Helen Cressy from the University of Oxford. Thank you very much, Simon. I wanted to ask, if you were founding the research centre now, would you call it the Centre for Global Tertiary Education? We talk a lot about tertiary rather than higher now, and I think perhaps that's designed to make explicit in some ways the knowledge formation and the work formation aspects of post-compulsory education. Would that now be the appropriate name for it?
Well, I think we're all going to agree with that one, Helen. Because Alice Runchar and Paul Ashwin put together a brilliant bid for another CGHE, if you like, called the Centre for Global Tertiary Education, and acknowledging the way in which policy is beginning to move in many countries, and Ellen has been part of that process of building tertiary systems and creating interfaces, good interfaces between the institutions in the different sectors within a tertiary system. And that's been a long historical moment, that one, long one coming, but I think we are moving in that direction. But we're not very far advanced yet. Let's not be too trite about this, and we've got a lot of work to do to see how that works. I worked on a couple of projects on that interface, and the cultural barriers are still quite considerable. The largest barrier is that the university academics don't want to give equal respect to other teachers and leaders in the tertiary space. We've built ourselves as dependent on status in so many ways in the university sector, and that's something people don't want to give away. They see it as a personal property, and it's very difficult. So all of that's part of the problem, but the larger problem probably is the underfunding of tertiary, the lack of status given to non-university tertiary. You see systems where it works. Korea and Taiwan have got good second systems, but academic drift takes over a bit. What tends to happen is you get the tertiary sector becomes more like a university sector over time, So that is also one of the issues that you need to confront when you're designing a tertiary system. How much division of labour between different roles, how much do you allow this kind of process of upward drift and the tendency towards a single model and so on. So, but I think, yeah, tertiary is the way to go, and we would have done, we do tertiary now, we were doing tertiary in this brilliant centre which Alice and Paul designed, and as I think you would realise, and everyone knows, that wasn't funded. Higher education or tertiary education has not had a second chance to build something like CGHE again, but I think that the blueprint remains there, and certainly the idea of tertiary will animate the field in future. I've got no doubt about that. I didn't pick that up because we haven't done that properly anyway. I didn't pick that up in my review of CGHE, but the next CGHE would certainly do that. On the future of Africa, well, it's such an important question, isn't it? Because, I mean, at a global level, because the demography is so powerful, and you know, Africa is going to be where many things are decided about the future of the world, I think. My colleague David Mills, who's going to be the next director of CGHE, and you'll hear from him several times today, certainly at the end of the conference when we effectively hand over to him, is the Africa expert in the room amongst us scholars, and he's probably better equipped to talk about what's possible. As far as I can see, whether we call it a university or not, post-school education has got a huge role in state building, as it always has everywhere, and it's a question of being able to fund it. And you can see this moment now coming, not in Africa but so much, but in India, where India is now finally beginning to pull it together in tertiary education and put serious money into building a proper system. It's going to take quite a while there because it's so fragmented, and you know, there's so many different languages, so many different cultures in India. Some states are much stronger than others socio-economically, but eventually they'll pull it off. It'll happen. It'll take time, and I think it's the same in all the countries which are building from a fairly low level. And the participation rate in Africa is still about 10%, and this is the gap in the world participation rate, if you like. Now the Central Asia has started going up, and Latin America's certainly gone up across the board in the last 30 years, as has East Asia and Southeast Asia. Africa is the place where that serious building is still to take place. And I think the problem is going to be to hold the line on proper provision which really helps people develop. And you know, the easy, cheap models are all, you give people lots of online education on mobile phones, and that's going to be enough, isn't it? Or you move in to tertiary development without a serious program of teacher training, which is just a central aspect of development of an education system. And of course, building schooling is just as important as building tertiary, and they need to go together. So all those lessons have been repeatedly learned, haven't they? And they have to be relearned every time a new state comes on the scene and starts to get serious about this. But of course, what it requires above all, and this is the same everywhere, is states with a longer term agenda, with a willingness to invest, you know, that are serious about building capacity in health and education and related sectors, or communications, other central sectors. You know, we depend on politicians who are really committed and have got goodwill, and they don't come easily, you know, in terms of the capacity to sustain a serious program over time. But it's a really important struggle, and I do think higher education is very much part of the solution.
Thank you, Simon.